Perfect, thanks. Does that intro fill you with some happiness inside? Maybe for some of you, dread, I don't know. It's a controversial topic maybe, friends, right? But I don't know, there's something about that intro that I kind of want in my life. Right? It is this picture-perfect example of the type of connection that I'm looking for. I want people who are going to be there with me when times are tough, when nothing's going right, when everything is just falling apart. And I think on some level, that's why we're here today. Because we think that we will get that in this place. Let's just start off with prayer. God, we just thank you so much that you give us community, that you've called us to community, and that you ask us to partake in it. And so, God, we ask that as we spend just a few moments together here, that you would just inspire us, that we would be lifted to your feet, that we would just see a picture of you to share with this world. In your name we pray, amen. So, Pew Research, they do a lot of polls and things like that for different Christian churches to figure out what is going on within Christianity, how is it that we're thinking, how is it that we're reacting, what are we doing? And so this is just kind of an interesting little chart that they have here of why Americans, it's not Canadians, it's really hard to find Canadian stats, but why Americans, and particularly evangelicals here, go to church. So they're given this survey, they're like, tick as many boxes as you want on it, but why are you showing up each week at church? And so the number one reason to be closer to God, that's kind of good, noble, I guess, right? But then you start looking through some of these, and all of a sudden you start to see some very interesting reasons people go to church, right? And the ones that really jump out at me, you'll see down towards the end, to be a part of a community of faith. 67% of people who took this said, I show up every week to church because I want to be a part of something. And then on top of that, if you look third one down, for comfort in times of trouble and sorrow, 69%. Do you think there's a tie-in between those two? You see those stats are pretty close to each other. We come to church because we want to be a part of something. We want to be a part of God, but we also want to be a part of something here. Something that can help us along in that walk because we're hurting human beings. And at the end of the day, we need people who will share our struggle with us. Is that what church is for? I want you to turn on your devices, go to Hebrews 10. It'll be up on the screen for you as well, but it says this, 10:24 and 25. It says, let us consider how to inspire each other to greater love and to righteous deeds, not forgetting to gather as a community as some have forgotten, but encouraging each other, especially as the day of his return approaches. Here we've got a very clear invitation for us to be a part of community. Because there's something special that takes place in community that doesn't happen in a one-on-one setting or by ourselves. Because whether we like it or not, we need people. We do. And I'll tell you, I actually kind of hate that. I do. You may not believe it, I'm an introvert. Okay? I'm an introvert who's just so passionate about things that I come off as an extrovert. But I'm an introvert. My dream job, before going into ministry and that, my dream job was to sit in a cubicle by myself and do my work. Can you believe that? I didn't really want to have to do this interaction thing. When I thought about going to university, you know what excited me? Going to one of these huge universities with the stadium seating classrooms where you are a number and you can just exist in yourself there. And then I went to Berman, CUC at the time, and there's like 6 people in your class sometimes. Very different. But as you go through Scripture, as you go through the New Testament in particular, you'll get 20, 30 verses that all talk about being part of this idea of community and the fact that we lean on each other and we rely on each other because it's something that we actually need. But do you get that when you show up here any given week? That's the question I have for you today. I mean, aside from pleasantries and a couple of handshakes and where during that first song we take a little bit of pause so you can say Happy Sabbath to each other, do you really feel like you connected with people on a meaningful level when you show up to church? I hope you do. I really hope you do. But I'll tell you, for me, it doesn't usually happen. It's one of the reasons why Aaron and myself are some of the last people to leave on a Sabbath when we're here. Because I'm actually craving some interaction with people on a meaningful, deeper level. And so I'll find a group that's also staying a little later, and I'll dive in a little bit more with them. Because I want something more than something superficial. I spent 10 years in ministry going to church every single week feeling lonely. The first 6 years was a church of 400 people. The last 4 years was a church of 1,200 people. I was lonely. Because all it is was surface interactions. Don't get me wrong, I loved the interactions I had with people. It was great getting to know just those glimpses of people. But even in my introverted self, I needed something more. So how do we do that with church? How do we make this community be intentional with relationship? If you're supposed to come to this place and feel loved and inspired and encouraged, how do we do that? I'll tell you what, it's actually very hard to do it in the way that we structure church. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against the way we structure church because I love what just happened up here a few minutes ago. I mean, it excites me, it gets me pumped. I want to worship God during our worship services. And when we've got speakers like Pastor Moses or Brandon up here, and they're pouring themselves out to you, I love the encouragement and the inspiration I get from their talks and the humor. But there's not really that connection still. So in this type of setting, it's not really going to take place. Because we've actually moved away from what the early church did. How they did church. And again, I'm not calling us to go back to it in that exact way. But there was something that they understood that was very important to community there. If you look with me in Acts 2, 45 to 47, we get this kind of typical approach to how we see the New Testament church. It says, they sold any possessions and goods that did not benefit the community and used the money to help everyone in need. They were unified as they worshipped at the temple day after day. In homes, they broke bread and shared meals with glad and generous hearts. The new disciples praised God, and they enjoyed the goodwill of all the people in the city. Day after day, the Lord added to their number everyone who was experiencing liberation. There's some really key things that are going on here. And it's not just some socialist mantra of we all need to be equal and spread the wealth and redistribute. There's something here saying community is so important to me that it will affect my own life in what I put into it. Community is something worth doing. So I love history. It's one of my degrees, actually. But when you look back at that early church, we see some pretty drastic changes. Because that early church, they actually met every Sabbath still in synagogue. They were still Jews. You realize that? Every Saturday, they showed up to worship in synagogue, to take part in the discussion and the teachings that were happening in that community. And then, this is where church community actually started for the early Christians. They met daily with each other. It wasn't church that was church community. Do you get that? It wasn't until about the 2nd century, so we're talking like 150 years after Jesus here, that all of a sudden we start seeing this shift away from that kind of a model. And all of a sudden there was this fear, and you can go and you can read the church fathers. There's a great website, I think it's earlychurchwritings.org or something like that. And you can read all of the church fathers. It's translated from the Greek. It makes it so much easier. There's this fear that develops with the church leaders. It's a fear that this thing God is doing is becoming too common. And it starts specifically with the Last Supper. Because every single time the church gets together, they break bread. They drink the wine. They remember what Jesus did for them. And they start going, you know what? No, we can't do this. We can't do this for every meal that we get together. It's becoming too common. We have to make it special. And so they start choosing specific times to make it special. And church, as we know it, starts to develop. A once-a-week meeting so that you can put your Christian practices into place once a week. And this develops until finally there is no community left in church. Church just becomes these massive structures with beautiful, beautiful music and beautiful decorations, but no community anymore. It's something that you sit there, you listen to, you go home. We see a change start to take place during the Reformation, where people go, no, that's not church. Church is more than just a ceremony. Church is community. And so you see church trying to pull away from that, coming back to a community model. Then we get into the American Enlightenment period. That's the mid-1800s, when all of a sudden churches are popping up everywhere. And you see churches trying to do it again, where they're like, no, church has to be more than just this weekly, once-a-week structure that we make it. You've got churches like the Salvation Army that develop, who say church is fundamentally about being together and helping each other. You've got the Adventist church. We pop up during this time period. We say, no, church is about us coming together and really studying, really developing something together. Do you know why, as Adventists, we typically order church the way that we do today? It's because of our tent meetings. When we were doing these revival, these evangelistic meetings out there, we had huge numbers of attendance from communities coming. And so when we finally organized as a church in the mid-1800s, and we said, well, what should our church service look like? They said, well, the tent meeting's been a success. Let's do that. That is actually where we get our structure from. But I want to say to you that this isn't just what church is about. John 13:34 and 35. Jesus gives us a picture of what our interactions are supposed to look like with one another. And he makes it as clear as he kind of can. He says this, "So I give you a new command. Love each other deeply and fully. Remember the ways that I have loved you and demonstrate your love for others in those same ways. Everyone will know you as my followers if you demonstrate your love to others." This is what church community is supposed to look like. When people think of the Christian church today, they're not supposed to think of a building or a service. They're supposed to think about what is it that we are doing amongst each other? How are we treating each other? Our Sabbath school lesson this morning, what does it mean to be a good person? Are you a good person because you are a Christian? Well, hopefully the answer is yes, because this is where your focus is. You're letting Jesus flow through you. But again, church is not just this building. You guys remember growing up, going to church, and you've got your children's program, and there's that little thing that they do with their hands. And does anyone remember how that goes? Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and you see all the people, or something along those lines, right? The idea that we are the church. And not just when we show up once a week here. We are the church in how we connect with each other through life. You know, Epic actually does a fairly good job in trying to facilitate these connection times. I love the fact that every single week, after this part is over, we do that part, where we go across to the other side of the building and we sit down for food. Because that was the common interaction when the early church got together. Whenever you see that they broke bread together, it means they're having a meal together. Because there's something about food that breaks down barriers. It allows you to start inserting yourself into other people's lives, where you can finally start making a real difference in someone else's life. The second thing is we've got our Epic Tribes. Next week, Epic Tribes, the small groups launch, November 10. And I want to encourage you, sign up for one. If one's not meeting at a time that works for you, start one. It has never been so easy to be a part of a small group as it is with Epic. Because no matter what you're doing, you can either be handed just a package that's fully put together for you that you don't even have to think about, and it's there. Or you can do something totally different. All right, so nice history lesson, right? What's the point of it all, though? Why do we need to focus on this concept of connecting with each other and with community? Because that's what it boils down to. Why even bother? And I think it's because we've been called. We've been called to bring light into a dark world. A world that gets increasingly darker the further we get along in history. Did you know that as many of 80% of people under the age of 18 suffer from loneliness? And I'm not just talking about, oh, I feel a little lonely today. I mean, like, there is something deep inside them that craves somebody in their life. That's a huge number. It gets a little better as you get into kind of those 30, 40-year-old years. Not much. We're into about 23%, I think it is, of people who suffer from chronic loneliness. And then 40% of adults over 65 years of age have chronic loneliness. And loneliness isn't something that you typically think it is. Because often when we think of lonely people, we think of people who are off on the sides of society, who don't interact with anyone. That's not the case. 60% of people who report loneliness are actually married. Loneliness does not depend on how many friends or relationships you have, because loneliness is a perception. It is something that affects how you see the world around you. And so even though you can be surrounded in a room like this full of people, you can feel incredibly lonely. And when you're looking at statistics that high of people who just want somebody to care, to connect, I go, there's our mission field. There's your easiest into touching someone else's life. Loneliness has gotten so bad that the UK has actually appointed a minister of loneliness in their parliament. That is his portfolio. So it's not the military, it's not social services, it's not the environment, it's loneliness. That is his one thing he's there to focus on. What could we as a church do to help combat that? And loneliness isn't just some mental thing that, we need to feel sorry for people who have it and say, but that's life. We all get lonely at some point in time. Did you know that if you're chronically lonely, it has the same negative cardiovascular effects on you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day? It increases your mortality rate by, get this, 26%. That's huge. And then here we are, a group that is specifically called to be in community. What an opportunity we have for this world. To connect with people. To not only take away that loneliness, but give them something better in place of it, which is Jesus. I think the most telling thing about why Jesus calls us into community with each other is the fact that the only actual way to tackle loneliness is through group. If Brandon is suffering from chronic loneliness, I can make it a mission to go and single him out. That's right, he's like, here he comes. But single him out and say, I don't want you to be lonely. You are a part of me. I'm a part of you. We're friends. Don't be lonely anymore. Guess what? It probably won't work. No matter how much I try to focus just my energy on Brandon, he will probably still feel lonely inside. But you know where that starts to change? When you have the entire worship band up here as a group, coming and surrounding themselves with Brandon and integrating him into the group and saying, hey, why don't you lead? I don't know. That is the only way that loneliness actually gets tackled, is through this small group model. So Pastor Moses wanted me to preach about small groups this week, if you haven't been able to tell yet. Because, like I said, November 10, Epic is launching their small group ministry, Epic Tribes. This is important for us to be a part of. This is exactly from the horse's mouth, as it were. This is exactly how Jesus modeled his ministry while he was here on earth. If you look at our last verse that we have here for today, it's Luke 10, 3 to 9. And it's kind of a chunk here, but I don't want you to miss the context of what's happening here. So this is his disciples at large. This is the larger group than the 12. This is the 70. It says, "It's time for you 70 to go. I'm sending you out armed with vulnerability. Like lambs walking into a pack of wolves, don't bring a wallet, don't carry a backpack. I don't want you to even wear sandals. Walk along barefoot, quietly, without stopping for small talk. When you enter a house seeking lodging, say peace to this house. If a child of peace, one who welcomes God's message,